Point.
I call Gareth Hughes.
Kia ora, Mr Speaker. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou kia ora. I rise to support the Kaikoura Marine Management Bill. Mr Speaker, the Green Party loves our oceans. We love marine reserves. We love marine protected areas. We've got a vision for New Zealand that every New Zealander can have their birthright and go swimming on oil-free beaches, to swim in a lake or a stream, to not get a 1 in 20 chance of getting sick when you swim in some of our monitored rivers. We have a vision that Kiwis can go out and put cray pots out with their dad, keep fishing. Mr Speaker, I'm a bit of a hopeless surfer, but Kiwis out there enjoying the surf, enjoying our treasured beaches. So I rise to support this bill, which is a small step in the right direction to protecting the waters, the coasts, the animals and species that we as New Zealanders love. This bill establishes a new marine reserve, whale sanctuary and other provisions off the Kaikoura coast. Mr Speaker, the Green Party will be voting in support of this bill. We've voted for it throughout. However, in this speech after the Select Committee, I would like to note some of our concerns around what the outcomes we see. So first up, we support this. We'd like to thank the committee. We'd like to thank the new chair, Maggie Barry. We'd like to thank the officials. We'd like to thank all the submitters. But most of all, we'd like to thank the local community in Te Korowai, who came together over 7 years to negotiate this. They used a gifts and gains approach to negotiate this, and the member is correct. They have been contentious in our country's past, but this one has had a measure of community support, which we welcome. Mr Speaker, it's great to see some marine protections on this coast, given New Zealand only has 0.41, that's less than half of 1% of our waters protected in marine reserves. What we know from all the evidence, from all the science, they're important, they contribute to economic development in our regions, they provide jobs for the local communities, and importantly, they actually work. They do protect the species and the ecosystems within it. So we support it, but let's touch on those three concerns I talked about. The first is that this process and this legislation soon to pass does not even meet the Department of Conservation and the Ministry of Fisheries Marine Protected Areas Policy and Marine Protected Areas Classification, Protection Standard and Implementation Guidelines. Mr Speaker, government officials and ministers who signed it off have done an awful amount of work on these guidelines over years to make sure we've got good best practice marine protected area policies like marine reserves, but in this case we actually see it absolutely disregarded, and actually what I would have preferred to have seen is a more effective marine protected area being established than what we see here. So the first is the guidelines haven't been met. Secondly, when it comes to the Hikurangi Marine Reserve, I think it's fantastic that we're using a marine reserve, the strongest protection measure we have, to protect this iconic feature of this coast, the Hikurangi Trench, an amazing feeding ground for whales, an important part of the local economy. Kaikoura runs off the whale watching operations. It's responsible for numerous jobs in that community. It's great to be protecting it. However, what we see with this marine reserve must be one of the oddest marine reserves in the country. We're talking about a 12-sided, it's hard to describe, a 12-sided marine reserve only covering the bottom, the benthos of the trench. The sides, the important biological and ecological diverse areas where there are a lot of fish, aren't protected. We're only protecting the bottom. Only 1.97 kilometres of the coastline is protected. So what you see is this very odd, complex, multi-sided shape with very little area touching the coast. We've heard the enforcement and detection fears with such a complex shape. We also heard from Dr Nick Shears, Senior Lecturer at the University of Auckland, who talked about the boundary effects. Now, any marine reserve, no matter how big it is, on the boundary, depending on the type of species that are resident to the marine reserve, obviously they're going to move. Be it a starfish moving slowly, or a crab, or a lobster moving maybe a little bit faster, a crayfish, or a fast swimming finfish who can swim much faster. What the boundary effects show is that the actual effective size of the marine reserve is reduced by the boundary effects. Now, when you've got such a complex 12-sided shape with it's very narrow, the boundary effects are magnified many times. What we heard from this expert on the Select Committee was that actually this marine reserve's real impact on the marine environment and those protected species is limited because of those boundary effects. Lastly, when you look at the new whale sanctuary, it's fantastic. We're protecting the local whale species, but the Green Party wouldn't have stopped just there. We don't think just a whale sanctuary is needed. What we need is a marine mammal sanctuary. There are other threatened and critically endangered species, such as the Hector's dolphin resident in the area. Now, by setting up this standalone whale sanctuary, the powers to protect those other threatened species threatened by the government's deep-sea oil drilling agenda and the gigantic underwater noise explosions, the seismic surveys, through to the lethal fishing nets which still haunt the Hector's and Maui's dolphins. These animals aren't being protected because we're only making a whale sanctuary. The Green Party would have extended this and used the Marine Mammal Protection Act 1978 provisions to apply a more generous, wider sanctuary encompassing more species. So in summary, Mr. Speaker, the Green Party supports this bill. We love our oceans. We want to protect it. We want to see New Zealand do a lot more than just the 0.41%, less than half of 1% protected in marine reserves. We've got concerns around the process, and the MPA guidelines weren't being used. The Hikurangi Trench is this odd 12-sided, complex, hard to enforce, boundary effects, magnified marine reserve. We think we could have done better. We could have had a larger, more uniform shape, and that's what the experts have advised the committee. And lastly, the whale sanctuary should have been extended to other animals. But we'll be voting in favour of it. I urge any interested submitters to read our minority report while supporting the bill points out these in a bit more detail. On a final point, Mr. Speaker, the clock's ticking down. You have to also ask the rationale why this is happening right now. It's taken 7 years and now the government's trying to rush it through, and the reason is the government's incredibly weak when it comes to the environment. New Zealanders tune into the TV and they see those dolphins which live in this area, the Hector's dolphins, their cousin the Maui's. They see a government who is risking their future, risking extinction because of their actions. We see a government who is happy to still allow lethal fishing nets in their sanctuary. We have a minister who is happy to sign off on great underwater noise explosions which can deafen the Maui's dolphin, the seismic surveys. We see a government who in the last 5 years has covered a third of the Maui sanctuary in marine mining permits that the Department of Conservation themselves say is troubling and is likely to degrade the Maui's environment. With 55 Maui's left, we shouldn't be gambling with their future for the pollution economy. When it comes to our sea lions, we're seeing them on a pathway to extinction because the actions needed to protect the New Zealand critically endangered sea lions not happening. A government who embarrassingly backed to the hilt, including with public subsidies, Trans-Tasman Resources with Dame Jenny Shipley as a director, a company that even the National's Environmental Protection Authority couldn't grant the permit to mine the iron sands in the blue whale area. And lastly, when it comes to the marine reserves, we've had a target for more than 14 years now to get to 10%. The size of this marine reserve is absolutely tiny. It only moves the decimal point when we come to the percentage of New Zealand's waters protected. The Green Party will get us not just to 0.41%, we will go further than this, the step in the right direction. We will get us to 30%. It starts with the Kermit X Reserve, which I have a bill in my name, which overnight takes us from 0.41% to 15%. Mr. Speaker, this election, a lot of people get a choice on how we look after our oceans. We support this, but I can commit to the people of New Zealand we would look after the Maui's dolphins, we would look after the whales, the sea lions, we would do more to protect our oceans, because ultimately it's our birthright as New Zealanders to swim in oil-free seas, to surf our beautiful beaches, to enjoy a coastline which hasn't been mined. I want my kids to grow up with a future with Maui's dolphins, not just hanging on, Maui's dolphins thriving. That's the future, that's the smarter, greener economy the Green Party are championing, and that's what we'll be doing this September. Kia ora, Mr. Speaker.
I call Kelvin Davis.